An arrogant millionaire is about to board his private helicopter after an exhausting meeting when the 7-year-old daughter of his cleaning lady runs desperately toward him, tears streaming down her face, crying, "Uncle, don't get in, the helicopter is going to explode." His first reaction is a condescending laugh, thinking it's just a childish fear. But when she throws herself into his arms and reveals something that makes his heart race, he decides to do something that shocks everyone. The Friday afternoon sun bathed the top of the Warren Tower in a lazy, golden light, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Richard Warren. The meeting had been a massacre, a brutal exercise in power where he'd had to reassert his control, crushing the dissent of an increasingly audacious board. He hated these displays of force, not for the act itself, but for their necessity. They were cracks in his armor of unshakable success, reminders that the empire he had built with his bare hands demanded constant vigilance. Now, all he wanted was the familiar hum of his helicopter's rotors, the safe refuge of his estate upstate, and the silence that money could buy. The smell of jet fuel mixed with the scent of new leather from the seats, a perfume that, to him, meant freedom and power. His pilot, a man of few words named Al, was already at the controls, awaiting the final nod. Richard loosened the knot of his tie, the last gesture to cast off the shackles of the grueling week. His gaze swept across the helipad, a domain of concrete and steel that hovered over the city, his private throne in the sky. It was then that he saw her, a small pink blur moving with desperate speed against the grey of the ground. Luna, the 7-year-old daughter of his cleaning lady, Elena. In recent weeks, the girl had become a quiet, curious presence in his routine. Sometimes she would wait for him at the end of the day beside her mother, holding a crumpled drawing of a crooked skyscraper that he always accepted with a formal nod. He considered her a small, harmless satellite orbiting his vast universe, a quaint detail in his rigidly structured life. But now there was nothing quaint about her run. Her small shoes slapped against the ground with an urgency that made a muscle in Richard's jaw twitch. Tears streaked bright trails on her dust-smudged face, and her mouth was open in a silent scream that the wind muffled. When she finally reached him, she grabbed the leg of his designer suit pants with surprising strength. Her breath came in short, sharp sobs. "Mister, no!" she choked out, her voice thick with panic. "Don't get in!" Richard arched an eyebrow, a condescending smile almost forming on his lips, a childish tantrum. She probably didn't want him to leave, a sentimental attachment he had no time to manage. "Luna, calm down. Mr. Warren is just going for a ride. I'll be back soon," he said, his tone paternalistic and distant, the same one he used to reassure nervous investors. He tried to gently pull away, but she clung tighter, the desperation in her dark eyes like two small bonfires. "No! You don't understand!" she cried, her voice rising an octave. "Oh, the helicopter is going to explode!" The phrase hung in the air, so absurd that Richard let out a short, dry laugh. Explode! What a vivid imagination! She probably watched some action movie on TV. He was about to scold her, to tell Elena to better control her daughter, when the girl did something that completely disarmed him. She threw herself into his arms, wrapping her thin neck around his chest, and buried her face in his expensive shirt. Sobbing uncontrollably, the warmth of her small, trembling body pierced through the layers of Egyptian cotton and his own indifference. "I saw them, mister. I swear," she whispered against his chest, her voice muffled by the fabric. "I saw strange men. They were messing with the engine when no one was looking. They said ugly things about you." Richard froze. The laughter died in his throat. This was no longer a child's fantasy. It was a testimony. There was a detail there, a specific image that didn't belong to the usual repertoire of childhood fears. "Strange men," he repeated, his voice suddenly serious. He looked over her head at the helicopter, a gleaming, perfect machine under the sun. Al watched him from the cockpit, his expression impassive. Richard's world, governed by logic and control, was suddenly invaded by the irrational, yet terribly sincere, fear of a child. And something in the purity of that panic, in the honesty of those tears, made him hesitate. A voice in his head screamed that this was madness, a waste of precious time, but the grip of Luna's arms around his neck felt like a far more powerful warning than any security report. He raised a hand, the gesture slow and deliberate, toward the pilot who was waiting for his order to depart. Richard's hand, suspended in the air, trembled for a fraction of a second before slowly lowering. The gesture, which should have been a command to take off, transformed into an order to cancel. He looked at the cockpit, meeting Al's confused gaze. "Shut it all down," Richard said, his voice deeper and firmer than he felt inside. "We're not going anywhere today." Al frowned, but nodded without question, beginning the shutdown procedures. The decreasing whine of the turbines seemed to amplify the tense silence that settled on the helipad. Richard finally disentangled himself from Luna's hug, crouching to meet her eyes. The facade of arrogance had cracked, replaced by a focused intensity he usually reserved for multi-million-dollar negotiations. "Luna," he began, his voice surprisingly gentle. "What exactly did you see?" Behind them, Eleanor approached, her face pale with dread. "Mr. Warren, I'm so sorry. She has a very active imagination. She makes up stories sometimes." Richard raised his hand again, this time to silence Elena, but his gaze never left the girls. "No, let her speak," he commanded. Luna sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I was playing hide-and-seek near the service stairs," she whispered, her eyes still wide. "Two men I've never seen here. They opened a little door on the helicopter. One of them was wearing a blue cap. He said you were a problem that was going to vanish into thin air. The other one laughed and said you were about to take a real fall in your approval ratings." The words, a distorted echo of adult conversations, came out of her mouth with chilling clarity. They were too many details, too specific to be invented. A shiver ran down Richard's spine. Take a fall. The cruel irony of the phrase hit him like a punch. He stood up, pulling his phone from his pocket. He dialed a number from memory. "Briggs, I need you on the helipad. Now," he said to his head of security, without preamble. "Bring the best maintenance tech team you have. Nobody touches the helicopter until you get here. Lock down the area." On the other end of the line, there were no questions. Just a, "On my way, sir." The wait was an agony. Elena tried to pull Luna close, murmuring apologies. But Richard kept her by his side, a protective hand on her shoulder. It was an unconscious, possessive gesture. This child was now a central piece in a puzzle he was only beginning to understand. He stared at the gleaming machine, which minutes before had represented his freedom and now looked like a waiting metal coffin. How could they have gotten so close? His security was legendary, impenetrable, or so he thought. The arrival of Briggs and his team was a relief. They were silent, efficient professionals who set to work with flashlights and specialized tools, moving with surgical precision. Richard, Elena, and Luna watched from a safe distance, three unlikely figures united by an invisible threat. Elena was trembling, probably imagining her job evaporating. Luna, for her part, seemed calmer, as if the simple act of being heard had transferred her burden to Richard's broad shoulders. After nearly an hour that felt like an eternity, Briggs approached. His face, normally a mask of professionalism, was grim. "Mr. Warren," he began in a low voice, ensuring only Richard could hear. The girl was right. Richard felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "What?" he managed to say, his voice a thread. "We found it. It's subtle. A chemically induced wear on a crucial hydraulic line. It would have ruptured under flight pressure in 20 minutes. Max, control would have been lost instantly. A catastrophic failure was inevitable." Richard looked at the small, disheveled figure now holding her mother's hand, a 7-year-old girl, a girl who liked to draw crooked buildings and who, with a desperate warning, had just saved his life. The gratitude that flooded him was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by a colder, darker feeling, an icy paranoia that began to seep into every corner of his mind. Who in his inner circle would have the knowledge, the access, and the audacity to orchestrate something so sophisticated and lethal? Briggs's confirmation was a sentence. Richard felt the world he had so meticulously built contract, the walls of his fortress of control, suddenly paper-thin. He thanked his security chief with a dry nod and turned to Elena and Luna. The mother still looked terrified, as if expecting a reprimand for all the trouble. The daughter, however, looked at him with unwavering confidence, as if she had never doubted he would listen. That look hit him more deeply than the sabotage attempt. For the first time in years, someone saw him not as a billionaire, a boss, or an adversary, but as Mr. Warren, a protector, and he had almost failed her. "Elena," he said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears, stripped of its usual arrogance. "I owe you more than I can express." Elena stammered something about just doing her duty, but Richard cut her off. "No, your daughter saved me. That goes beyond any duty." He looked at Luna. "You were very brave," he said, and the praise was sincere, without artifice. A small, shy smile bloomed on the girl's lips. The next day, Richard's paranoia began to take shape. He called an emergency meeting with his most restricted inner circle. But the faces he saw around the polished mahogany table looked different. His directors, his advisors, even his long-time personal assistant. Who could he trust? Every glance, every gesture seemed to carry a double meaning. The COO, Owen, a man who had been with him for over a decade and whom Richard considered a friend, was the most vehement in his condemnations. "This is a direct attack, Richard. It's barbaric. We need to find those responsible and destroy them," he exclaimed, his face red with indignation. Owen's loyalty was comforting, but a new seed of distrust had already sprouted in Richard's heart. What if the greatest loyalty was just the best performance? He spent the weekend locked in his office, reviewing reports, security access logs, visitor records. Every detail was a potential loose thread. On Monday, the first wave of retaliation came, but it wasn't directed at him. It was cruel, cowardly, and terrifyingly effective. Richard was in his office when his HR manager, a bureaucratic and unimaginative man named Walter, requested a meeting. "Mr. Warren," Walter began, adjusting his glasses on his nose, "I regret to inform you, but I've had to make an administrative decision regarding the cleaning staff employee, Elena Santos." Richard put down the pen he was holding. "What decision?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "I have proceeded with her termination for cause," Walter said, consulting a folder in his hands. "We received multiple complaints about professional negligence, specifically for allowing her minor child to circulate unsupervised through the company's facilities, putting the child at risk and violating multiple safety regulations." Richard felt the blood rush to his head. It was a sham, a fabricated accusation. So transparent in its malice, it was insulting. It was a message for him. They were eliminating the witness, punishing the savior. "Who made these complaints?" he snarled. Walter swallowed hard. "They were anonymous, sir, but formally logged. I was just following protocol." Richard stood up, the chair scraping loudly on the polished floor. He walked to the window, his hands clenched into fists so tight his nails dug into his palms. He looked down at the city below, a sea of anonymous faces, but he knew the enemy was close enough to manipulate his own HR department. It was a smart move, public, documented, seemingly legitimate. Any interference on his part to reverse the termination would look like favoritism. undermining his authority and raising suspicion. They were boxing him in, forcing him into an impossible choice: protect his corporate reputation by maintaining the image of an impartial leader who follows the rules, or protect the innocent family who had risked everything for him. To the conspirators, the choice for Richard Warren, the ruthless magnate, seemed obvious. They were counting on his ego, his obsession with the image of control. But as he looked out at the vastness of the city, he didn't see his buildings or his businesses. He saw Luna's small, frightened face, trusting him, and he realized that the choice he would make would not be the one his enemies expected. He dialed Briggs's number. Locate Elena Santos. Immediately, tell her not to worry about a thing. And find out who logged those complaints. I want names. I don't care what you have to do. The battle was no longer just about his life. It was about his soul, and he wasn't about to lose it. Briggs was fast. In less than an hour, he located Elena in her modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood in Queens, miles away from the luxury of the Warren Tower. Richard listened to the report over the phone, the security chief's voice describing the scene. Elena crying quietly in the kitchen, the termination letter on the table, and Luna beside her, trying to comfort her with colorful drawings. The image hit him with the force of a physical blow. The cruelty of the retaliation was abject. He had built an empire, but he couldn't protect a woman and her child from such a blatant injustice within his own company. Impotence was a poison he was not used to tasting. Following Richard's instructions, Briggs reassured Elena, promised that Mr. Warren would take care of everything, and left an envelope with enough cash to cover their expenses for the next few months. It was a temporary solution. A bandage on a wound he knew was much deeper. The hardest part came later. Briggs couldn't trace the origin of the complaints. They were made through a public access terminal in the lobby, sir. Anonymous logs, just like Walter said. Too clean, too professional. Elena's firing was just the beginning. The conspiracy, sensing that Richard might not behave as predicted, began to tighten the screws on the family. Subtlety gave way to more direct intimidation. The first was a letter. It arrived in the mail 2 days later, a plain brown envelope with no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper with one sentence printed in computer block letters. Curious children sometimes get lost. Stay quiet. Terrified, Elena called Briggs immediately, who in turn reported to Richard. The veiled threat was unmistakable. They were no longer just trying to silence the witness. They were using the child as a weapon against him. Richard's rage became a cold, controlled fire. He ordered Briggs to install a discreet surveillance system in Elena's building and assigned 2 of his best men to monitor the family from a distance, 24/7. It wouldn't be an overt protection, which might attract more attention, but an invisible shield. The surveillance soon proved necessary. Briggs's men began reporting the presence of a black sedan with no license plates parked on Elena's street at odd hours. The vehicle never stayed long, just enough to make its presence felt. It was a psychological warfare tactic designed to fray nerves, to make Elena feel constantly watched, cornered. Then the accidents began. One night, a water pipe in the hallway on Elena's floor mysteriously burst, flooding the entrance to her apartment. The building's super, an elderly man, swore the maintenance was up to date. The next night, the power in their apartment was cut, while all the neighbors' lights stayed on. The electric company found no technical fault. They were small acts of sabotage, impossible to prove as malicious, but which, taken together, painted a terrifying picture of persecution. Each incident was a message to Richard. We can get to them any time. We control their environment, and you can't do anything. Richard felt increasingly entangled in a web he couldn't see. His enemies were ghosts, moving in the shadows of his own organization. The frustration ate at his patience. He wanted direct action, a confrontation, but he was fighting whispers and unexplained accidents. The worst part was the daily phone call to Elena. He insisted on speaking with her and Luna to make sure they were okay. Elena's voice was increasingly fragile, laden with fear, but Luna's remained surprisingly steady. "Don't worry, Mr. Warren," she said on one of the calls. After her mother told her about the power outage, "I'm not afraid of the dark. Mommy taught me that the dark is when the stars shine brightest." The innocence and resilience of that little girl were the only light in the darkness that enveloped him. He realized that the escalating intimidation had a dual purpose, not only to silence the witnesses, but also to test him, to provoke him, to force him into a mistake. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that his enemy's next step would not be so subtle. They had shown they could disrupt. Now they would show they could destroy. The pressure was becoming unbearable. Richard spent sleepless nights, his mind spinning on a carousel of suspicion. Every executive, every business partner, every familiar face was now a potential traitor. He felt like a king in a glass castle, exposed and vulnerable. Despite all his wealth and power, the facade of control he presented during the day was an increasingly heavy mask. The only thing that kept him focused was the determination not to let his enemies win. They wanted him to feel isolated and powerless, and he refused to give them that satisfaction. He knew the only way to fight ghosts was to turn on a light so bright they had nowhere left to hide. That's when he decided to stop reacting and start acting. He needed information, hard data, not just suspicion. He needed someone from the outside, someone with no prior loyalties or blind spots within his organization. He contacted a private investigation firm, one of the most discreet and expensive in the country, known for its ability to unearth corporate secrets. He met with the lead investigator, a man named Cy, in an anonymous coffee shop, far from the prying eyes of the business elite. Cy was the opposite of Richard. He wore rumpled clothes, had a world-weary look, and spoke in monosyllables. But his reputation was impeccable. Richard told him everything, from Luna's warning to the intimidation tactics against Elena. He handed Cy a list of all his directors, major investors and competitors. "I want you to dig into all of them," Richard said. "Financials, connections, recent conversations. I want to know who would benefit from my taking a fall." Cy listened without taking notes, his small, shrewd eyes absorbing every detail. "This will be expensive," he finally said. "Money is not the issue," Richard replied. "Time is, and discretion is absolute. No one, not even my head of security, can know about you." Cy nodded. "Understood. The first thing I'll look for is a pattern. People like the ones you're describing don't usually do this just once." While Cy began his silent hunt, Richard focused on keeping Elena and Luna safe. He knew their apartment was no longer a refuge. After a long conversation, in which he had to use all his powers of persuasion to overcome Elena's proud reluctance, he convinced them to move, not to one of his luxurious properties, which would make them obvious targets, but to a secure and anonymous location that Briggs prepared, an upper-middle-class gated community in another city under false names. It was a drastic measure, tearing the small family from their life, their community. Richard felt the weight of that decision. He was trying to protect them, but at the same time, he was imprisoning them. "It's just for a little while, Elena," he promised, "until I solve this." Deep down, he wasn't sure if that was a promise he could keep. The move was done in the middle of the night, a clandestine operation that seemed straight out of a spy movie. Richard supervised it all personally, from a distance. Watching them leave, with only a few suitcases, filled him with a sense of guilt and responsibility. He was turning their lives upside down to fix his own. In the new, safe and comfortable apartment, Luna seemed to treat it all as a grand adventure. She explored every room with curiosity, declaring that the view from the balcony was better than from Mr. Warren's office. Her ability to find joy amidst the chaos was a balm for everyone's anxiety. On their first night in the new place, Richard called. Luna answered. "Mr. Warren, we have a pool. Can I learn to swim?" she asked, her voice bubbling with excitement. Richard smiled, a genuine smile, the first in many days. "Of course you can, little mermaid. As soon as this is all over, I'll teach you myself." The promise warmed him, giving him a glimpse of a future worth fighting for, but the calm was brief. 3 days later, Sai called. His voice was urgent. "I found something," he said. "As a pattern, just as I suspected. Your case isn't the first, it's the third." Sai's revelation fell on Richard like a slab of concrete. "Third," he repeated, his voice low, a chill running down his spine. "Explain." On the other end of the line, Sai's voice was devoid of emotion, a clinical report of terrible events. In the last 2 years, 2 other prominent businessmen suffered accidents. One, a brake failure at high speed. The other, a fire on his private yacht, both fatal, both investigated and closed as tragic accidents, no signs of foul play. Richard felt his stomach churn. He knew the names. They were competitors, men who, like him, had built their empires from scratch. The press at the time had mourned the losses, celebrated their legacies, and moved on. No one had connected the dots. "What links these cases to mine?" Richard asked, his brain working furiously. "In the aftermath," Sai replied. "In both cases, after the leader's accidental elimination, their companies went through a restructuring, and in both cases, controlling stock eventually, subtly, passed to a consortium of foreign investors, represented by the same investment fund. A fund that, by chance, made an aggressive offer for one of your subsidiaries last month. An offer you refused." The puzzle was beginning to take a monstrous shape. This wasn't a simple personal vendetta or a sabotage attempt. It was a systematic, predatory, and lethal scheme. They didn't just want to hurt him. They wanted to take him over, erase him, and absorb his empire, just as they had with the others. Elena's firing, the intimidation tactics, they weren't just to silence her. They were to distract him, to keep him busy with smaller problems while the real attack was being prepared. Richard felt a wave of cold fury. They had underestimated him. They thought he was just another target on their list. "Who's behind this fund?" he asked. "That's where it gets complicated," Sai said. "It's a web of shell companies, P.O. boxes, nominee directors. Tracing the real owner is like trying to catch smoke with your hands. But I'm working on it." What I did manage to intercept, however, was an exchange of encrypted emails. They talk about Operation Helix and the need for a natural succession at Warren Enterprises. Operation Helix. The name was a taunt, a mockery of his near-fatal end. The information changed everything. Richard now knew he wasn't dealing with common criminals, but a sophisticated, patient organization that planned its moves months, perhaps years, in advance. This also meant the danger hadn't passed. The first attempt had failed, but they wouldn't give up. They would just change tactics. He needed an edge, something they wouldn't expect, and that edge, he realized, was hidden in the mind of a 7-year-old girl. "Luna," he murmured to himself. "The strange men," she saw. Her description was the only visual lead he had on the perpetrators. He called Eleanor, his heart tight with the need to involve them even more in this danger. "Eleanor, I need a favor. It's about Luna," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I need you to talk to her again, calmly. Ask her to draw the men she saw on the helipad, every detail she can remember, their faces, their clothes, anything." Eleanor hesitated. "Mr. Warren, I don't want to scare her, to make her relive that." "I know, Elena, and I hate myself for asking," Richard said, the sincerity in his voice cutting through the air. "But your daughter's memory might be the only thing that can save us. All of us." There was a long silence. He could hear Elena's breathing, the internal struggle between a mother's fear and the understanding of the situation's gravity. Finally, she relented. "Okay, I'll try." 2 hours later, Elena sent a picture via her phone. It was 2 drawings done with colored crayons, stick figures, as any child would draw. But there were details. One man had a black line over his eye, a scar. The other wore a blue cap. As Luna had said, but in the drawing, she had added a small logo, a T intertwined with an FE. Richard stared at the initials. TF. It meant nothing to him. It seemed like a meaningless clue, a childish detail. He sent the image to Sai, without much hope. The investigator's response came in less than 10 minutes, and it was a shock. TF, Phoenix Trucking. It's a logistics company, a subsidiary of one of the companies that was absorbed by the investment fund after its owner's accidental death. And guess who the contract manager at Phoenix Trucking is? An ex-security guy with a scar over his eye. Richard looked at the childish drawing again. It wasn't a scribble, it was a portrait, and he had just identified one of the men who tried to kill him. The identification of the man from Phoenix Trucking was the turning point. For the first time, the conspiracy had a face, a name, a tangible link to the corporate world. Richard felt a jolt of adrenaline, the sensation of a hunter who finally finds the trail of his prey. The forced passivity of the last few days gave way to a fierce urgency. However, the revelation also brought with it a terrifying complexity. If a subsidiary of a supposedly acquired company was involved, it meant the rot was spreading, infecting parts of the business world he considered neutral or even allied. The network was larger and more integrated than he had imagined. He and Sai agreed they needed more proof before making any move. Accusing a man based on a child's drawing and a circumstantial connection was risky. They needed something that linked that man and Phoenix Trucking directly to someone inside Warren Enterprises. It was at that moment that Richard realized the depth of the betrayal surrounding him. The saboteur would have needed precise information, his schedule, the gaps in the helipad security routine, the exact moment he would be alone. That level of detail couldn't come from a stranger. It had to be someone from the inside, someone he trusted. The paranoia that was once a diffuse feeling now focused on a single point of pain. He began to re-examine every interaction, every conversation from the weeks leading up to the incident. And it was then that the image of Owen, his COO, surfaced in his mind with painful clarity. Owen, always helpful, always present. Owen, who oversaw logistics and facility security. Owen, who had unrestricted access to his schedule. Owen, who had been the most vocal in his outrage, perhaps to deflect attention from himself. The idea was so monstrous that Richard initially rejected it. Owen was more than an employee. He was almost family. Dinners at his house, vacations with their families together, a godfather to his eldest son. A betrayal from him wouldn't just be an act of greed. It would be the annihilation of a decade of trust and friendship. Sai, with his ruthless objectivity, didn't share Richard's emotional conflict. "The friend is always the perfect suspect," he said dryly over the phone. "He has the access, the motive, and the ideal cover. Let me focus on him." In the following days, while Richard maintained a facade of normality, treating Owen with the same cordiality as always, an act that required every ounce of his self-control, Sai delved into the director's life. What he found was devastating. Owen, the exemplary family man and loyal executive, was drowning in gambling debt, massive debt. Debt his generous salary couldn't possibly cover. And, in recent weeks, he'd received a series of large deposits into an offshore account, funneled through shell companies that ultimately led back to the same investment fund behind the other hostile takeovers. The proof was there, cold and irrefutable, in bank statements and transfer records. Owen's loyalty wasn't to Richard, but to the highest bidder. The confirmation of Owen's betrayal was the deepest stab Richard had ever received. It was worse than the helicopter sabotage. The machine could be fixed, but the shattered trust was an irreparable loss. The pain was so sharp that for a moment he felt paralyzed, unable to breathe. The empire he had built suddenly seemed hollow, a stage for greed and falsehood. But then, the pain morphed into a cold, lucid anger. He would not crumble. He would expose Owen and everyone involved. However, before he could even begin to plan his next move, the enemy, perhaps sensing their conspiracy was unraveling, made their cruelest and most desperate play. Richard was in his office, reviewing the data Sai had sent him, when his personal cell phone rang. It was Elena. Her voice was a strangled scream, torn by the purest panic he had ever heard. "Mr. Warren, they took her. Luna, she's gone. On her way to school, they took my daughter." Richard's world collapsed. The gratitude he felt for the girl turned into absolute despair. His savior was now in mortal danger, and it was all his fault. Elena's scream echoed in Richard's mind long after the call ended. It was the sound of a parent's worst nightmare, a sound that shattered the last barrier of his professional composure. The luxurious office, with its panoramic view of the city, became a cage. He felt a despair so profound it was physical, a pressure in his chest that made it hard to breathe. They had taken her. They had taken Luna, the brave girl who had saved him, who had become an unexpected symbol of purity in his cynical world, was now a hostage, a bargaining chip. And the guilt was crushing him. He had put her in danger by listening to her, by believing her, by bringing her into the center of his private war. The security he had provided, the false names, the secret apartment, it had all been useless. His enemies were bolder, more ruthless than he had predicted. They were no longer playing with intimidation, they were playing with lives. He acted on instinct, his mind seized by a feverish clarity. The first call was to Briggs. "They have the girl. I want all your men on the street. Every security camera image, every potential witness. I don't care about the cost. Find her." His voice was a low, dangerous growl. The second call, more difficult, was to Sai. "Forget the discreet investigation. The time for subtlety is over. They have the girl." On the other end of the line, Sai remained calm. "This was a possibility, Mr. Warren. It's an escalation. They're desperate. That means we're close." The investigator's composure was a counterpoint to Richard's storm, but it offered no comfort. The third call he expected, the one from the kidnappers, didn't come. Instead, a message arrived on his cell phone from an unidentified number. There was no text, just an image. It was a photo of Luna. She was sitting in a chair in a dark, windowless room. She didn't look hurt, but her face, normally so expressive, was pale, and her huge eyes were fixed on the camera with an expression of fear and confusion. Beside her, on the floor, was a newspaper. The date was today's. The message was clear. She was alive, and they had her. As Richard tried to process the horror of the image, Owen walked into his office without knocking. His face was contorted into a mask of concern. "Richard, what's that look? Did something happen?" he asked, false solicitude dripping from every word. Richard had to use all his willpower not to launch himself at him, not to smash that charade with his bare hands. He had to play the game. Luna's life depended on it. "Personal issues, Owen. Nothing you need to worry about," Richard said, his voice tense. Owen placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. The touch burned Richard's skin. "You know you can count on me for anything, my friend, anything." The word "friend" was a knife twisting in the wound. Richard just nodded, unable to speak. When Owen finally left, Richard collapsed into his chair, shaking with rage and helplessness. He was trapped, forced to interact with the traitor, the man who had likely orchestrated the kidnapping of the child who saved him. His relationship with Elena became a daily agony. He called her every few hours, though he had no news to give. He listened to her sobs, her voice broken by pain and fear, and every word was an indictment of his failure to protect them. "I should never have let you involve us in this," she cried on one of the calls. "I want my daughter back, Mr. Warren. I just want my daughter back." And Richard could offer nothing but empty promises. "We will find her, Elena. I swear on my life." But he knew his enemies didn't want his life. They wanted his silence, his capitulation. They wanted his empire. The absence of Luna was a black hole that sucked all hope. The days dragged on in a fog of anxiety. Work at Warren Enterprises continued. Meetings were held, deals were closed. But for Richard, it was all a theater of the absurd. He was just playing a role while his real life was on pause, suspended on the fate of a kidnapped girl. He looked at the city's skyscrapers, symbols of his power, and they had never seemed so useless. What good was it to be a king if he couldn't protect the most important person in his kingdom? The wait for a ransom demand or any form of contact from the kidnappers was psychological torture. Richard felt like an animal in a trap, forced to wait for the hunter to decide his fate. Every ring of the phone, every incoming email brought a wave of hope and dread. But the silence persisted, and that silence was more terrifying than any threat. It was a constant reminder that they were in control, dictating the pace, heightening his agony with every passing hour. Meanwhile, life at Warren Enterprises became an emotional minefield. Having to face Owen every day was the greatest test of self-control Richard had ever faced. He watched the COO lead meetings, give orders, and smile at colleagues, all with the appearance of normality. Behind that facade of efficiency, however, Richard now saw the darkness, the greed that had led him to betray a decade-long friendship and participate in the kidnapping of a child. In a board meeting, Owen presented an aggressive restructuring plan, citing market vulnerabilities. It was a brilliant plan, but one that Richard realized with a chill would subtly weaken the Warren family's control and open doors for outside investors. Specifically, the fund Psy was investigating. Owen was laying the groundwork for the takeover, acting as if Richard's natural succession was already a foregone conclusion. Watching that performance was nauseating. Richard had to argue against the plan, using cold logic and data, while his mind screamed the truth he couldn't reveal. "It's too risky, Owen. Hasty," Richard said, his firm voice belying the turmoil within. Owen looked at him with feigned disappointment. "Richard, sometimes you have to have the courage to make the tough decisions. I thought you, of all people, would understand that." The hypocrisy was suffocating. In parallel, Briggs and Psy's search for Luna continued, frantic but frustrating. The kidnapping had been executed with frightening precision. The security cameras on Luna's school street had their recordings corrupted by a power surge at the exact window of her disappearance. The few witnesses described only a generic delivery van with no logos, that no one found suspicious. It was more proof of the conspiracy's sophistication and resources. They had the ability to manipulate the city's infrastructure to cover their tracks. Richard felt the net closing in, not just around Luna, but around him as well. He was being isolated, his options dwindling by the day. It was then that his enemies decided to attack on a new front, one he hadn't expected. He was in his office at the end of a long day when his assistant entered, her face pale. "Mr. Warren, there are some men here to see you. From the IRS. They have a warrant to search and seize." Richard stood up, stunned. The IRS. He was meticulous with his finances. His company, a model of tax compliance. It was impossible. 3 men in dark suits entered his office. The leader, a man with a severe face, presented the warrant. "Mr. Richard Warren, we are investigating allegations of tax irregularities and capital flight. We need access to all your financial records, personal and corporate." It was a masterstroke, a calculated legal maneuver to paralyze him. While he was bogged down in a fabricated tax investigation, his attention would be diverted from the search for Luna. They could scour his servers, destroy any evidence of the conspiracy he and Sai might have stored, and all under the guise of a legitimate investigation. They were using the system itself against him, turning the institutions meant to protect the law into weapons for their crimes. As the agents began to seal computers and demand access to files, Richard looked out the window. The city, his empire, now seemed like a chessboard where he was in check, his every move anticipated by an unseen and merciless adversary. And the most important piece, his queen, little Luna, had been captured. The legalized invasion was overwhelming. The IRS agents, with their bureaucratic efficiency and unquestionable authority, took over the executive floors of Warren Enterprises. They were like a swarm, moving with a clear purpose, confiscating hard drives, file boxes, and laptops. Richard was forced to watch, helpless, as the heart of his empire was methodically picked apart. He knew the investigation was a sham, a theater orchestrated by his enemies. But the warrant was real, the credentials were legitimate, he had no way to fight back. Owen, predictably, played the part of the shocked and loyal subordinate. "Richard, this is an outrage, an attack on your reputation. We'll fight this with all of our legal resources," he declared in front of other employees, his voice ringing with false indignation. Richard just watched him, the bitterness in his mouth like bile. Owen wasn't just watching the fire, he was holding the gas can. The operation's true goal quickly became clear. Under the guise of investigating finances, the agents, or whoever was pulling their strings, were systematically isolating Richard from his own information. His personal servers were the first to be taken. On them were the encrypted communications with Sai, the preliminary reports, Luna's drawings. Fortunately, Sai was paranoid enough to never use direct channels. But the risk that something could be uncovered was immense. The investigation served a triple purpose: to tarnish his public reputation, paralyze his operations, and, most importantly, cut off his lines of communication and investigation into Luna's kidnapping. It was a brilliant, diabolical move. For 48 hours, Richard was trapped in limbo, answering questions from lawyers, trying to calm a panicked board of directors, and, above all, pretending his world wasn't falling apart. Amidst the chaos, the only person he could be truly honest with was Elena. He called her, his voice heavy with exhaustion, and explained the situation. "They're trying to bury me in paperwork, Elena. They're trying to make me forget." "Don't you forget her," her voice came back, weak but fierce. "No matter what they do, don't you forget my daughter." "Never," Richard promised. "Never." That promise became his anchor. While the agents turned his life inside out, he focused on a single goal: finding Luna. He met Sai secretly in an underground parking garage, the air heavy with the smell of damp concrete. "They're cleaning house," Richard said, "destroying any evidence we might have." Sai, impassive as ever, lit a cigarette. The small ember glowed in the darkness. "That's good," he said. Richard stared at him, incredulous. "Good. They're winning, Sai." "No," the investigator replied, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "People only clean house when they know the dirt is about to be found. They're scared. The kidnapping, the audit. These are the moves of a player who's losing faith in their hand. They're overplaying." Sai's perspective, though cold, gave Richard a new breath of life. His enemies were reacting, not acting. They were responding to a threat they felt. But what? What could they possibly fear? The answer came from a source so unlikely, Richard almost laughed at the irony. Briggs, his head of security, who had been working day and night on the search for Luna, called. "Sir, we found something. It's not the girl. It's different." He sent Richard a series of photos taken by one of his men. They were of a trash can in a park, several miles from the kidnapping site. Inside, among food scraps and old newspapers, were several crumpled pieces of paper. They looked like children's scribbles, drawings. Richard enlarged the image on his phone. His heart leaped. He would recognize that style anywhere. They were Luna's. One drawing showed a house with a large red antenna on the roof. Another showed a car, and next to it, a man with an angry face and a bow tie. Richard looked closer. The bow tie. It was the trademark of one of the investors who had been pushing hardest for Owen's restructuring plan. Luna wasn't just a hostage. She was watching. And somehow, the brave little girl was sending messages from the heart of enemy territory. The discovery of the drawings was like a bolt of lightning in the oppressive darkness. Richard stared at the images on his phone, his heart pounding against his ribs. They were more than scribbles. They were dispatches from a 7-year-old spy. Luna, even in captivity, even terrified, had found a way to fight back, to communicate. Her intelligence, disguised as childish innocence, was extraordinary. She wasn't just waiting to be rescued. She was actively participating in her own rescue. The resilience of that child was a source of strength that Richard greedily absorbed. He immediately called another clandestine meeting with Sy and Briggs, this time at one of Warren Enterprises' construction sites. A skeleton of concrete and steel where the whistling wind would muffle any listening devices. He showed them the drawings. The house with the red antenna, Briggs said, pointing to the first drawing. Could be anywhere, but it's a specific detail. We can cross-reference it with properties linked to our suspects. Sy, however, was focused on the other drawing. The man in the bow tie, he muttered, his eyes narrowed. That's Arthur Pintz, one of the main shareholders in the investment fund. He's obsessed with bow ties. It's his personal brand. Suddenly, the pieces began to fit together in an even more sinister way. It wasn't just Owen. It was a network that included high-level investors, people who sat on boards and attended the same social events as Richard. The conspiracy was deeper and wider than he had ever imagined, and Luna, somehow, was at the center of their operations. She hadn't been taken to a random hideout. She was in a place where she was seeing these people. They took her somewhere close to them, Richard said, the realization dawning on him. It's arrogance. They think no one would ever make the connection, that she's just a child, an insignificant witness who doesn't understand what she's seeing. Briggs's team began a frantic search, cross-referencing property lists of Arthur Pintz and other suspects with satellite imagery, looking for anything that matched the house with the red antenna. Hours turned into a day, then 2. Frustration began to set in again. Meanwhile, the pressure from the IRS audit intensified. The agents, now clearly acting on outside orders, began leaking selective information to the press. Small articles started appearing on financial blogs, questioning the integrity of Warren Enterprises, hinting at creative accounting practices. It was a smear campaign designed to erode market confidence and justify the takeover they planned. Richard was fighting a war on 2 fronts, a public one for the soul of his company and a secret one for the life of a child. It was during a sleepless night, while sifting through Sy's files for the 100th time, that Richard had an epiphany. He was looking at Owen's financial records, at the deposits to the offshore account. The sender's name was a shell company, International Logistics Solutions, a generic name designed not to attract attention, but something bothered him. The date of the first major deposit. It was almost 2 years ago, long before the helicopter sabotage attempt. Owen's betrayal wasn't recent. It was old. Richard felt a chill. Why would Owen be receiving money from an entity linked to the conspiracy for so long? What had he done to deserve it? The answer hit him with the force of a divine and terrible revelation. It wasn't about him. Not at first. The conspiracy to take over Warren Enterprises was old, a long-term plan. And Owen was their man on the inside, their Trojan horse. But why the sudden rush? Why the sabotage, the kidnapping? What had changed? He pulled up the files on the other two victims, the businessmen who had died in accidents. He looked at the dates, and then he saw it. A week before the sabotage of his helicopter, Richard had announced a new philanthropic initiative, the creation of a scholarship fund for the children of low-income employees. Luna would have been one of the first beneficiaries. He remembered the conversation with Elena, how her face had lit up. He had taken a personal interest. He had asked about Luna by name. That was it. The plan had been to wait, to let Owen slowly pave the way for a natural takeover. But Richard's sudden personal interest in the family of a cleaning lady, a family that lived near the service entrance to the helipad, was an unforeseen variable. It created a potential bond, a future where a grateful child might one day mention something to her new benefactor. They couldn't risk it. They had to accelerate their plans, to remove him from the board before that bond could ever form. They had to silence the witness before she even knew she was one. His act of kindness had signed his death warrant and, ultimately, led to Luna's abduction. The irony was devastating. He remembered mentioning it in a meeting where Owen was present. The conspiracy hadn't accelerated because of a business threat. It had accelerated because of an act of kindness. His growing closeness to Elena's family, his genuine interest in Luna's well-being, was perceived as a threat. They feared that Elena, feeling indebted, might reveal something Owen had told her in confidence. Or perhaps, in their paranoia, they simply saw any deviation from Richard's script as a risk. The act he considered a small gesture of decency was what had lit the fuse. He wasn't targeted for being a ruthless billionaire. He was targeted for starting to act like a human being. The night Briggs called was the night the chessboard flipped. "We found it, sir," he said, his voice crackling with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. An isolated ranch house in the Catskills, registered to a shell company that Cy traced back to the investment fund, and on the roof, visible by satellite, a large radio antenna painted a bright, peeling red. Richard closed his eyes, and the image of Luna's drawing projected itself onto the darkness of his eyelids. It was there, she was there. The relief was a physical wave, but it was immediately followed by an icy fear. Now that they knew where she was, the risk was greater than ever. A poorly planned rescue attempt could have fatal consequences. He knew he couldn't just storm the place. They needed a plan, a way to get Luna out and, at the same time, corner the conspirators once and for all. And it was Owen who gave him the perfect opportunity. The next morning, the COO walked into his office, his face a mask of grave concern. "Richard, the situation is untenable," he began. "The board is in a panic. The press is destroying us. I've called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. Me, you, Arthur Pintz, and a few of the other key investors. We need to present a drastic solution to save the company." The trap was set. The emergency meeting was the stage for his checkmate. They would force him to sign documents, perhaps under duress, transferring control of the company, and then he would become an accident like the others. Richard looked at Owen, the man he once called a friend, and felt a glacial calm wash over him. "You're right, Owen. It's time for a drastic solution," he agreed. "I'll be there." After Owen left, Richard made 2 calls, one to Briggs and one to Cy. "It's today," he said. "They're bringing me to the slaughterhouse. Be ready." The executive boardroom felt like a mausoleum. The air conditioning blew a cold draft that had nothing to do with the temperature. Seated at the polished mahogany table were Owen, Arthur Pintz with his trademark bow tie, and 2 other investors whose names Richard knew were linked to the predatory fund. They were the architects of his ruin, gathered in his own sanctuary to preside over his downfall. Richard walked in and sat at the head of the table, his rightful place, feeling their gazes like predators sizing up their prey. Owen began the meeting, his voice full of false solemnity, speaking of the crisis, the need for a strong leader without the personal and legal burdens. Richard now carried. The solution, he presented, was simple. Richard would sign over a proxy, giving them total and temporary control of the board until the dust settled. The papers were already on the table. Richard listened to it all in silence. He let them expose their entire plan, their entire betrayal, disguised as corporate concern. When Owen finished and pushed the papers toward him, an expectant silence filled the room. Richard looked at the documents, then at the faces around the table. He smiled, a smile devoid of any warmth. "No," he said, the word dropping like a stone into the silence. He pushed the papers back. "Indeed, I'm not signing anything." The shock on their faces was almost comical. "Richard, don't be a fool," Arthur began, but Richard cut him off. "No, you were the fools. You and Operation Helix," he said, savoring the panic that bloomed in their eyes as they heard the code name. "Did you think I was just another one on your list? Do you think I don't know about Phoenix Trucking, about the offshore accounts, about what happened to the others?" Owen recovered his composure first, forcing a laugh. "Richard, the pressure has gotten to you. You're delusional, paranoid." "He's having a breakdown," Arthur added, looking at the others as if dealing with a madman. "You have absolutely no proof. These are just the ramblings of a desperate man." Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady and piercing. He let their contempt hang in the air for a moment. "Proof," he repeated calmly. "My proof isn't on a piece of paper. My proof is on her way, and she's 7 years old." At the exact moment Richard spoke those words, the double doors to the boardroom swung open. Briggs entered, not alone. By his side, holding his hand tightly, was Luna, and behind them, with a look of steel and determination, was Eleanor. The silence in the room was so absolute you could hear the soft hum of the ceiling lights. The faces of Owen and Arthur Pintz transformed, shifting from shock to disbelief and finally to pure dread. It was as if they had seen a ghost. Luna, wearing a simple denim dress, looked small and fragile in the imposing environment, but her eyes, fixed on the men at the table, held a strength that belied her size. Elena placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder, her chin lifted in a silent challenge. "What is the meaning of this?" Owen stammered, standing up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Security, get them out of here!" But Briggs remained motionless at the door, an impassive guardian. "I think they have a right to be here," Richard said, his voice resonating with a newfound authority. "After all, they're the centerpiece of your conspiracy, aren't they?" He turned to the little girl. "Luna, do you know any of these gentlemen?" Luna, without hesitation, pointed a small, decisive finger at Arthur Pintz. "Him," she said, her voice clear and firm. "The man with the ugly tie. He got mad when I didn't eat my soup." Then her finger moved to Owen. "And him. He's the one who took me from school. He said he was taking me for ice cream, but he lied." Each word was a nail in the coffin of their denial. The direct identification, coming from the victim herself, was devastating. "This is absurd, a farce," Arthur shouted, his face crimson. "This child has been coached, manipulated by a man who's lost his mind." Owen, desperate, tried one last gambit. "He's using his cleaning lady's daughter to create a narrative. Richard is suffering from paranoia, inventing enemies. This evidence is a product of his disturbed imagination." It was then that Eleanor stepped forward, holding a small digital recorder. "My daughter has not been coached, and Mr. Warren is not paranoid," she said, her voice trembling but unshakable. "And I am not just a cleaning lady." She pressed play. Owen's voice filled the room, recorded in a phone conversation he'd had with Arthur, intercepted by Sai. "The girl is becoming a problem. She notices too much. We need to accelerate the meeting and force the signing. Once we have control, she and the mother disappear. No loose ends." The recording continued, detailing the plan to force Richard's resignation. The evidence was irrefutable. The room fell into a deathly silence, broken only by the sound of Owen's heavy breathing. The game was over. The web of lies and manipulation unraveled in an instant. As the conspirators stared, paralyzed, Richard explained how they had been outmaneuvered. Briggs's team hadn't stormed the ranch house. They created a diversion, a fake gas leak on the main road, forcing the kidnappers to evacuate the location temporarily. It was in that window of opportunity that they had rescued Luna, without a single confrontation. Cunning had beaten brute force. The outcome was swift. With the recording and Luna's testimony, the sham IRS audit collapsed, revealing the agents as corrupt officials paid by the conspiracy. Legitimate authorities, alerted by Psy through anonymous channels, arrived and took Owen, Arthur, and the other investors into custody. As Owen was being handcuffed, he shot one last look at Richard, a look that contained no remorse, only the bitter hatred of a defeated man. Richard stared back, not with triumph, but with a profound sadness for the friendship that had been a lie. With the room finally empty, leaving only him, Elena, Luna, and Briggs, the tension dissipated, replaced by an overwhelming emotional exhaustion. Richard knelt in front of Luna, his heart overflowing with a gratitude that words could not express. "You were the bravest girl I have ever met," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Luna gave a small, shy smile. "I wasn't that scared," she said. "I knew Mr. Warren would find me." In that moment, Richard Warren, the magnate, the billionaire, the man who controlled an empire, felt humbled. He hadn't found her, they had saved each other. He looked at Elena, whose face was finally relaxing into tears of relief. He saw in them not a cleaning lady and her daughter, but the family that loyalty and courage had forged in the fire of adversity. The war was over, and amidst the ruins of his old world, he knew that a new life, based on far truer values, was just beginning. 5 weeks after that desperate cry on the helipad, the Friday afternoon sun once again bathed the top of the Warren Tower. But everything was different. The air didn't smell of jet fuel. As the helicopter was in storage, a silent reminder of a crisis overcome. In its place, the aroma of damp earth and flowers came from the new rooftop garden that had been planted, Luna's idea. Richard was there, not in an expensive suit, but in khakis and a cotton shirt. He watched Luna, who now ran through the garden with the same energy as before, but her runs were no longer of panic, but of pure joy. Beside him, Eleanor smiled, a serenity on her face that Richard hadn't seen since it all began. The transformation in their lives had been complete and profound. The conspiracy scandal rocked the business world. The revelation that Owen and a group of investors were behind a series of accidents, and the attempted hostile takeover of Warren Enterprises was the story of the year. But Richard handled the fallout in a way no one expected. Instead of hiding or selling the company, he opened it up. He called a press conference and told the whole story, not omitting his own initial arrogance or the crucial role of Luna and Eleanor. He used the platform not for revenge, but to start a conversation about corporate ethics and responsibility. Warren Enterprises, under his new direction, became a model of transparency. The first major initiative was the creation of the Luna Foundation, a robust, well-funded program to protect and support whistleblowers and their families, ensuring no one would ever have to go through what Elena had. But the biggest change was personal. Richard's gratitude for Elena and Luna deepened into a genuine affection, a sense of belonging he had never felt before. He realized the loneliness of his success had left him emotionally impoverished. Elena's loyalty and Luna's courage had shown him what a real family was, not one of blood, bound by obligation, but one of spirit, bound by sacrifice and love. After a long process and with Elena's enthusiastic consent, he legally adopted Luna, becoming the father she never had and giving himself the family he never knew he needed. Elena, in turn, found her true calling. Richard discovered her history as a former investigator and impressed by her integrity, put her in charge of the company's new ethics and compliance division. Giving her the resources and authority to ensure a conspiracy like that could never again take root in his organization. The final scene unfolded on that sunny rooftop. The new family was inaugurating the garden, a space of peace and life where before there had been only concrete and power. Luna, holding a watering can, was teaching Richard the name of each flower. Her natural perceptiveness remained, but it was now nurtured in an environment of safety and love. She was leading a small initiative at school, a junior detective club, which playfully taught other kids about the importance of observing and reporting strange behavior to trusted adults. "Look, Dad," Luna said, pointing to a sprout pushing through the earth. "It's growing." Richard smiled, a smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. He didn't look at the sprout, but at her and Elena. Yes, it was growing. Everything was growing. Hope, love, a second chance. He had learned the most valuable lesson of his life. True wealth wasn't in bank vaults or at the top of skyscrapers, but in the unbreakable bonds of loyalty and in the wisdom that sometimes comes in the frightened whisper of a child. The helicopter, once a symbol of his isolation, was now a memorial to his redemption. A reminder that the most important warnings come from the purest voices, and that true leadership isn't about control, but about protecting those who dare to tell us the truth.